The Intolerable Acts, as their colonial opponents referred to them, was a series of parliamentary legislation passed by British Parliament in the 1760s and 1770s, which served as the causal precursor to the Revolutionary War. Basically, the large incentive for the 13 colonies to wish independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain and to demand taxation with representation, as opposed to the alternative they believed they were feeling as a result of these intolerable acts. Now, up until the 1760s, the 13 colonies had been feeling a type of almost economic deregulation or a lack of interference on their economies by the British government in what was called salutary neglect. And this itself was perhaps one of the reasons why the Revolutionary War took off, because as a result of British isolation from many of the affairs of the 13 colonies, they began to develop their own culture, their own forms of government, their own philosophies, their own constitutions, and basically their own way of life, independent of that of Great Britain. So that may have actually contributed to the cultural as well as political reasons that independence was so strong there as opposed to other British colonies in the 18th century. But really, it was the acts themselves, the Intolerable Acts, that gave the real political fuel in the engine of independence and incentivizing the Revolutionary War to occur. Basically, the first Intolerable Act took place in 1763, and it was called the Proclamation Act. And basically, it was a British legislation which created a border between the 13 colonies and the western parts of what we would now refer to as the United States in order to prevent another costly war with Native Americans. Basically, the British had created a line or a maximum extent to which the colonists could expand their property and territory and engage in land speculation. As before then, colonists were basically crossing over the border and into Native American territory, and as a result, the British felt they were bearing the brunt of costs in waging wars against the Native Americans. And it's important to understand the context of this time, as the British had just fought a costly war known as the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. And basically that had drained the British bank account, even though they were technically victorious in that war. So basically they were trying to extract as much money, influence, and prevent as many costs as possible in their primary colony, or rather primary colonies, the 13 colonies in the modern United States. The second and perhaps most notable Intolerable Act was the Stamp Act. And basically this legislation, as in the name, placed a huge duty or international tax not only on the sale of stamps, but also the sale of newspapers, paper, and basically any printed item in the colonies. Now, technically, this act was a steep tax, but it really wasn't the most expensive tax that Great Britain had placed on other colonies around the world, or even on its own citizens in British territory, in local British territory. But the reason why it was so infuriating to the colonists was because it was the first time in decades where they had received a serious tax on an everyday commodity. And they felt that they had been that this tax had been unfairly placed upon them because they, of course, had no vote. There was no colonial parliamentarian in the British legislature, and so they felt as if they were being taxed without representation. Now, the second course of acts that came around was a little bit afterwards, and they were referred to as the Townshend Acts. And they were actually passed in response to major colonial protest, boycotts, and discontent with the British Stamp Act. What they did was they reversed the Stamp Act policy, and basically the new Prime Minister, Townshend, basically passed a new set of acts to replace it called the Declaratory Acts. Now, these acts were meant to be a positive substitute to the Stamp Act, but in fact, they actually infuriated the colonists even more, because the Declaratory Acts basically stated, as in the name, that the British government could declare any tax they wanted at any point, and could declare any rejection by the colonists a form of treason. Now, this really spearheaded a group of individuals called the Patriots, or basically individuals who strongly believed that the character as well as the political sovereignty of the 13 colonies should be prioritized, and that everything should be done to ensure that the opinions and the beliefs of the population living in the 13 colonies would be represented in legislation acted upon the 13 colonies. One of the leading organizations for this was the Sons of Liberty, which basically sent propaganda as well as even arms and militants to help ensure that the British were not overstepping their boundaries by imposing control over the 13 colonies. And this organization was led by the uncle of future President John Adams, Samuel Adams. And that's probably why we named a beer after him. Now, towards the early 1770s, a new act was passed called the Tea Act. And this act was perhaps the most notorious because it wasn't an actual tax on the colonies. Rather, it was a tax exemption for the East India Company, or the official English monopoly on tea trade. Basically, there had been a decline in tea sales in the Indian Ocean, where they typically sold. Therefore, they wanted to recapitalize their profits on the 13 colonies, and to do so, the British government gave the East India Company a huge tax exemption to make sure that no local colonial tea company could compete with them. As a result, the colonists and the Sons of Liberty engaged in this huge masque, or this kind of theatrical performance, if you will, called the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans, as Mohawk Indians, basically went on the ships of the East India Company and threw tea out. This was a major symbol of resistance towards British control, and it was ultimately one of the precursors that led towards major popular discontent with British policy over the region. A second major event also occurred in response to British control when the British began sending soldiers into colonial territory and actually forcing local colonists to house British soldiers in what was called the Quaternary Act. As a result, basically in 1770 in Boston, many colonists began throwing items, objects, and perhaps even dangerous commodities at British soldiers, began mocking and jeering them, and trespassing on British territory or soldier territory on the Boston soil. Therefore, British troops ended up opening fire on colonists in what has become known as the Boston Massacre, one of the most infamous events leading up to the American Revolution. While one of the main deaths in this war was a man named Crispus Attucks, a former slave, a free black, and this ultimately led to major propaganda on behalf of colonists in their tirade against British control of their lands and of their policies. As a result of all of this, two organizations were founded, the First and Second Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress, which met in around 1773, basically convened of all representatives from the 13 colonies, including many familiar faces, such as John Adams, Alexander Hamilton. At least he wasn't an official delegate, he was just observing the instance, as well as Thomas Jefferson, as well as Benjamin Franklin, Samuel Adams, and other major figures who would later be called founding fathers, who basically convened to create the first Continental Assembly, or the first legislature of the 13 colonies, as well as the fact they proposed giving aid to the Sons of Liberty and to other organizations that were promoting patriotism in the 13 colonies and that were boycotting British goods and British taxes that they deemed were unacceptable or, of course, intolerable. As a result of the Boston Tea Party, the First Continental Congress, and other rebellious activities that the British deemed unacceptable, the British Parliament passed perhaps one of the most intolerable of the Intolerable Acts, the Coercive Acts, in 1774. This act basically closed the Boston harbor for a temporary period and resulted in the British gaining control of all local Massachusetts courts and all pardonings and political affairs of the Massachusetts judicial and criminal justice system, as punishment for the Boston Tea Party and other rebellious activities. This was probably the biggest nail in the coffin to any chance that the colonies would accept a peaceful resolution to British intolerability in the 13 colonies, and as a result, the Second Continental Congress convened in the Philadelphia area, which basically stated that now they would do anything possible to ensure that the British lay off of them in any capacity, basically wanting effective independence, or at least semi-independence from British sovereignty. Now, technically, there were initially peaceful attempts to gain this goal, as the Olive Branch Petition, created by John Adams, was meant to engage in a diplomatic solution to this conflict. But ultimately, it was only a matter of time before violent confrontation broke out in Lexington and Concord in late 1775, beginning what historians refer to as the Revolutionary War.